The night air hung heavy over the temporary processing station on Okinawa. It was late June 1945, humid, windless, and unbearably still after weeks of fighting. Inside a dimly lit tent, a group of Japanese women officers stood in silence, uniforms torn, faces streaked with dust and exhaustion. Their boots were caked with the island's red clay, their eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time since their capture, no one barked orders at them. The only sound was the low murmur of Allied medics sorting supplies behind a canvas partition. A table creaked as an American corpsman set down several small items. Standard issue, nothing extraordinary by Allied standards. Bars of soap wrapped in waxy paper. Metal tins of lip balm meant to protect against sun and wind. Basic toiletries lined up with the same precision as ammunition. When the women were told these items were for them, they hesitated. Confusion rippled through the group. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the gesture with everything they had been taught about the enemy, or with the scarcity they had lived under for years. That moment of hesitation is where the Real story begins, one shaped long before this tent in Okinawa. To understand why a bar of soap and a small tin of lip balm could unsettle trained officers of the Imperial Japanese military, we must step back into the structure, expectations, and realities of Japan's wartime world. By 1945, the Japanese Empire was still vast on paper, but in practice it was collapsing under the enormous weight of its own ambitions. The demands of a global war stretched supply lines past their limits, starving not only frontline troops, but the very systems that sustained basic daily life. Women serving the empire were no exception. Japan's wartime mobilization had drawn thousands of women into auxiliary military roles. They served as nurses, communications clerks, administrative officers, and logistical staff throughout the home islands and the overseas empire. Though they were not formally enlisted as combat soldiers, many held ranks within the Army Nursing Corps or the Women's Volunteer Corps, with responsibilities that placed them close to the front. Their training emphasized discipline, rigid obedience, and emotional restraint, virtues the imperial military believed essential for service to the emperor. Appearance and conduct were part of this discipline. Cleanliness, neatly kept uniforms, and personal modesty were viewed as reflections of moral strength. A well-groomed exterior signaled an ordered inner world. Yet by 1944, these ideals confronted a harsher reality. Japan no longer had the industrial capacity, shipping tonnage, or raw materials to sustain such standards. Coal shortages crippled factories. Allied submarine warfare severed transport routes. The chemical industry, responsible for producing soap, disinfectants, oils, and even basic toiletries, withered under relentless air raids. Civilians on the home islands were already scraping by with rationed household soap and improvised substitutes. For women in the military, especially those serving in remote island garrisons, personal hygiene products had become luxury items. Even sanitary supplies were scarce. Officers often carried a single bar of soap for months, scraping it thin until it crumbled. Lip balm, a trivial item in the United States, was virtually non-existent in Japan by the final year of the war. This shortage did more than cause discomfort. It chipped away at dignity, morale, and the psychological armor expected of Japanese personnel. The imperial ethos demanded stoicism, yet deprivation made even basic self-care impossible. Nurses treated wounded soldiers without access to proper disinfectants. Clerks wore uniforms that could not be washed. The environment of constant scarcity reshaped expectations. The absence of comfort became normal, and the idea of receiving something non-essential felt almost alien. As the war drew closer to Japan's southern frontier, many women officers were assigned to Okinawa, a critical defensive bastion. They arrived on an island already strained by years of militarization, with supply convoys threatened or destroyed long before reaching port. Daily life slipped into full austerity. Officers learned to ration everything: water, rice, medical supplies, bandages, even threads for mending uniforms. Soap became a strategic asset, used sparingly, traded privately, and sometimes locked away. By the time the Battle of Okinawa erupted in April 1945, these women had lived for months, some for years, under conditions that eroded the familiar rhythms of normal life. The brutal American bombardment, the destruction of infrastructure, and the severing of all remaining supply routes pushed them deeper into deprivation. Hygiene became a distant memory. The dust, smoke, and humidity clung to their skin. Their lips cracked open in the island's wind. Their hands, exposed to constant labor and limited sanitation, grew raw. They had no means to restore the sense of order their training demanded. When the Japanese defensive lines finally collapsed, many women officers, nurses, clerks, and signal operators were swept up in a mass of survivors seeking refuge along cliffs, caves, and makeshift shelters. For those captured, surrender was not merely a military defeat. It was a profound cultural shock. Surrender in Japan carried heavy stigma, particularly for women who represented discipline and service. The Allied process of handling prisoners, while systematic, was entirely foreign to them. Thus, when they reached the temporary processing facilities established by American forces, they carried not only fatigue and hunger, but an internalized expectation of harsh treatment. Imperial propaganda had long depicted Allied troops as brutal and inhuman. Many women truly believed they would be struck, humiliated, or worse. Instead, they were lined up, examined for injuries, and directed toward basic medical and sanitation stations, standard procedure under Allied regulations. It was in this world, shaped by deprivation and fear, that they approached the small table inside the tent that night. A few neatly wrapped bars of soap, a handful of lip balm tins, items so mundane to their captors, yet so scarce within their own military that they no longer seemed real. And it was precisely because of this disparity that the simple act of offering these supplies created a moment of stunning emotional dissonance, one that could only be understood by tracing the path that brought them here. It is at this point that the broader context must expand even further, why the Allies considered these items essential, and why the contrast between the two forces was so stark. To fully understand why Japanese women officers reacted with such visible shock when handed lip balm and soap, we must look at the other side of the tent, the Allied world that produced, distributed, and normalized these items even in the midst of war. The contrast was not simply economic. It was cultural, logistical, and psychological. By 1945, the United States military operated with an enormous industrial engine behind it. American wartime production dwarfed that of every Axis power combined, generating not only weapons, ammunition, and vehicles, but also the overlooked essentials that maintained soldier health: toothbrushes, disinfectants, soap rations, shaving kits, sanitary items, and first aid supplies. These are not luxuries. They were written directly into standardized supply manuals and medical guidelines. Sanitation was considered integral to combat readiness. This approach shaped nearly every Allied operation in the Pacific. Field hospitals, mobile aid stations, and prisoner processing units carried standardized hygiene kits, predictable, replenished, and mass-produced. Even forward-deployed units received regular shipments of toiletries in their K-rations and medical packs. For American medics, providing basic cleaning supplies to prisoners was simply part of proper wartime protocol: disease prevention, morale management, and adherence to the Geneva Convention. But this system contrasted sharply with Japan's deteriorating logistics. Allied officers on Okinawa noted repeatedly in their reports how Japanese prisoners, especially women, who were often expected to maintain higher personal standards, appeared exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in grime that came not from neglect, but from months of having no materials to stay clean. The officers' reactions were not merely emotional, but practical. Hygiene affected everything from wound healing to internal discipline. Thus, when Japanese women officers entered the processing tents, they stepped into an environment where the routine of sanitation was almost clinical. American personnel inspected for lice. They cleaned wounds. They distributed soap because every prisoner, regardless of rank or nationality, was expected to wash before being moved to a holding area. Lip balm, too, had a defined purpose, preventing sun cracking, which could lead to infection. To Allied medics, handing out these items was as normal as issuing water. But to the recipients, nothing about it felt normal. For years, wartime propaganda in Japan had depicted the Allies as cruel and morally corrupt. Women in service were taught to expect violence, humiliation, or execution if captured. In this psychological landscape, the sudden appearance of generosity, or even simple practicality, clashed with everything they had been told. Cleanliness itself held symbolic meaning in Japanese culture. Dirt was not merely physical. It carried connotations of disorder, shame, and moral erosion. To receive items associated with purification from an enemy who was supposed to be monstrous created a deep internal conflict. The women officers' hesitation, therefore, was not rooted in pride alone. It was shaped by cultural expectations, military indoctrination, and a prolonged collapse of material conditions. The concept of an enemy offering such intimate items, things meant to be applied to the skin, the lips, the hands, felt intrusive. It challenged boundaries that Imperial discipline had enforced since their induction into service. Allied personnel, unaware of this cultural nuance, interpreted their reaction simply as fear or uncertainty, not recognizing the deeper layers beneath. Reports from American medical detachments on Okinawa described Japanese female prisoners as reserved, unresponsive, or startled by ordinary items. Some medics noted that certain prisoners initially refused to accept soap until reassured through gestures or interpreters. Others accepted the items, but held them carefully in their palms, as if unsure whether they were meant to use them immediately or preserve them for later. A few women began to weep, quietly, discreetly, overwhelmed by the mixture of exhaustion, relief, and confusion. Their training had never prepared them for kindness from the enemy, nor for the exposure of vulnerabilities long concealed under military discipline, nor for the realization that the war had left them materially deprived in ways the Allies simply did not experience. This is where the deeper contrast emerges. The Allies treated hygiene as a scientific matter. The Japanese military, stretched thin and embattled, treated it as an unfortunate casualty of war. The Allies viewed soap and lip balm as basic necessities. Japan, by 1945, viewed them as distant remnants of a world consumed by conflict. This divergence created the emotional shock inside the tent, a moment where two wartime realities collided across a single wooden table. As dawn broke over the processing station, the significance of that moment expanded far beyond the small cluster of supplies. It illuminated the entire psychological gulf between the two sides, revealing how cultural expectations, material conditions, and propaganda shaped the reactions of the women now standing silently in line. To uncover the complexity of this moment, we must examine it from multiple angles: human, cultural, medical, logistical, psychological, and military. Each reveals a different layer of meaning behind what seemed, at first glance, a simple gesture. The first and most immediate layer of this moment is human. War strips away illusions, but it also strips away ordinary comforts until the smallest objects gain disproportionate emotional weight. By the time Japanese women officers were processed on Okinawa, exhaustion had settled deep inside them. the kind that drains not only strength but identity. Many had worked tirelessly in underground hospitals or command posts, living on minimal rations, with little water and no protection from the elements. Their uniforms were stiff with dried sweat and soil. Their lips had cracked in the island wind long before they reached American lines. When the officers were handed soap and lip balm, the gesture struck directly at this buried exhaustion. The women's bodies reacted before their minds did. Their hands trembled. Their posture shifted. Their expressions tightened, not from fear of attack, but from the unexpected recognition of something intimate, something that touched the memory of a life before the collapse of everything familiar. For some, the items evoked their pre-war routines, washing one's face in a cold basin before a long shift, preparing uniforms before inspections, applying small amounts of oil or balm during winter months. These memories have been pushed aside by the brutal rhythm of survival. To have them suddenly resurfacing was overwhelming. This human response, a mixture of vulnerability, disbelief, and shame, reveals how deprivation had reshaped their understanding of normalcy. It also explains the quiet ache visible in their faces, the realization that the enemy possessed what their own empire could no longer provide. But this moment cannot be understood purely on emotional grounds. It was also shaped by deep cultural foundations that govern Japanese expectations about dignity, cleanliness, and conduct. Japan entered World War II with an ingrained cultural framework built around order, purity, and disciplined presentation. These values were especially emphasized for women serving in any military or state capacity. Cleanliness was considered a reflection of inner virtue. Maintaining neat uniforms and composed appearances was not merely cosmetic. It reinforced the moral authority expected of women working within the imperial system. But the collapse of Japan's wartime infrastructure forced a painful contradiction between cultural ideals and wartime reality. By 1944, soap was rationed strictly. Oil-based cosmetics and balms were almost non-existent. Women in military service often resorted to improvised substitutes, diluted ash, seawater, or rough cloths, none of which provided real hygiene. This gap between expectation and reality became a quiet source of shame. The officers knew the standards they were expected to uphold, but they simply lacked the materials. Thus, when Allied personnel placed lip balm tins and soap bars before them, the cultural shock ran deeper than deprivation alone. Accepting such intimate object from an enemy disrupted the strict boundaries between Japanese military personnel and foreign forces. For women officers especially, anything that touched the face or skin had a symbolic meaning. It implied vulnerability, exposure, and a breach in the self-contained composure they had been taught to maintain. Moreover, wartime propaganda in Japan painted the Allies as morally corrupt. The idea of an enemy providing items associated with personal purity and care clashed violently with that narrative. It forced the women to reinterpret not only the present moment, but the entire cultural lens through which they had viewed the war. This cultural tension intersected closely with another angle: the medical realities faced by both sides. The third layer stems from medical necessity. The Pacific War was shaped as much by disease and environmental stress as by combat. Tropical climates, heat, humidity, and limited sanitation made infections a constant threat. The U.S. military responded with a robust medical doctrine. Hygiene was preventive medicine, as critical as ammunition. Every field kit reflected this philosophy. Medics carried alcohol wipes, disinfectant powders, soap, ointments, and balms not only for soldiers, but for any prisoner brought into their care. Japan's medical system, although staffed by highly dedicated personnel, faced extreme shortages. By 1944, even frontline hospitals lacked basic disinfectants. Nurses boiled bandages for reuse. Surgical procedures were conducted with limited sterilization. Lip cracking, skin infections, and untreated wounds were common among women officers working long hours in underground shelters. To American medics, the officers' condition was clinical evidence of malnutrition, fatigue, and lack of supplies. Their distribution of soap and lip balm reflected medical protocol. Clean wounds, prevent infection, stabilize morale, and reduce physical distress. The officers, however, did not see these items through a clinical lens. Their military culture had not conditioned them to interpret small hygiene tools as medical assets. In Japanese doctrine, especially under wartime austerity, the body was expected to endure hardship without complaint. Thus, the medical purpose behind the Allied gesture was invisible to the women receiving it. They experienced it instead as an unexpected, almost bewildering moment of care. The practicality of the items was overshadowed by the emotional and cultural weight attached to them. Yet these three angles, human, cultural, and medical, form only half the picture. The full complexity emerges when viewed from logistical, psychological, and gender-military perspectives. The shock of receiving soap and lip balm cannot be separated from the logistical realities of the war's final year. Japan's supply chain had imploded long before the Okinawa campaign began. Merchant shipping losses mounted to catastrophic levels. Factories producing oils, chemicals, and household goods either shut down or suffered repeated bombing. Even the home islands struggled to supply hospitals with disinfectants, much less garrisons on remote or embattled islands. By contrast, the United States operated the most extensive logistical system in military history. Across the Pacific, fleets of cargo ships, Liberty vessels, and supply convoys moved tons of materials with near-clockwork precision. Frontline units routinely received food, medical kits, and hygiene supplies even under combat conditions. A single task force could consume more soap in a week than an entire Japanese division received in a month. This logistical asymmetry created a visual and psychological shock for Japanese women officers. The American processing tents were stocked with items so abundant they seemed mundane. Cardboard boxes of toiletries rested casually on tables. Medics treated them as disposable. The same supplies that Japanese personnel saved, rationed, or went without were present in American hands in near-overwhelming quantity. This abundance revealed a truth the officers already sensed. Japan had lost control of the war's material dimension. It was not just the presence of soap and lip balm, but the ease with which they were distributed that amplified the humiliation. The women understood, without needing explanation, that the empire's industrial defeat was complete. Still, material contrast alone did not shape the moment. The psychological impact ran far deeper. Wartime psychology shaped the reactions of both the captured women and the Allied personnel handling them. The Japanese mindset at the time of surrender was conditioned by ideology and fear. For generations, notions of honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice have been embedded into military culture. Surrender, especially for officers, carried profound stigma. For women, the sense of failure was intensified, not only as soldiers, but as representatives of Japanese womanhood under wartime ideals. The presence of soap and lip balm, while seemingly insignificant, became emotional triggers. These items represented normalcy, order, and dignity, elements stripped away during their long months of deprivation. Receiving them from the enemy created a psychological rupture. Relief mixed with shame. Gratitude clashed with fear. Exhaustion wrestled with disbelief. Allied personnel often misinterpreted the officers' stunned reactions. Some believed the women were confused by the purpose of the items. Others assumed they were still afraid of mistreatment. But the truth was more complex. The women were confronting a moment that contradicted everything they had been taught about enemy intentions and wartime hierarchy. There was also a quieter psychological dimension. Many officers had internalized the belief that they must not show vulnerability in front of foreign men, a cultural expectation reinforced from training. But the simple act of receiving an object that touched the skin or lips made that emotional concealment harder to maintain. Some women wept silently not because the items were symbols of kindness, but because they highlighted the collapse of their internal defenses. This psychological unraveling was intensified by one final angle: the gendered expectations that shaped their experience from the start. The final angle is specific to the role of women in Japan's wartime military structure. Women officers, though respected for their professionalism, were burdened with dual expectations: to embody the resilience of military service while upholding the cultural ideals of femininity. Their appearance, conduct, and emotional composure were judged more strictly than those of male personnel. Yet these same women served in some of the harshest environments of the Pacific War. They worked in underground hospitals without ventilation, managed communications during bombardments, and assisted in field operations under constant threat. Their responsibilities were heavy, but the tools to maintain dignity, clean uniforms, hygiene supplies, or basic skincare, disappeared as Japan's logistical network collapsed. Thus, by the time they stood in American processing lines, their condition reflected not only the hardships of war, but the breakdown of every expectation placed upon them. Their cracked lips, unwashed faces, and tattered uniforms symbolized a failure they subconsciously carried, even though the true cause lay far beyond their control. To be handed lip balm and soap by Allied personnel was, therefore, not simply the distribution of supplies. It was a reassertion of roles, the enemy providing what their own military could not. The gesture unintentionally highlighted the gulf between the expectations Japan placed upon its women officers and the reality of what it had been able to support in the last days of the war. As a result, the encounter acquired an unspoken emotional weight, one that lingered long after the women moved past the tables and into holding areas. These 6 angles: human, cultural, medical, logistical, psychological, and gender military, together form the full context of that moment. But the narrative now approaches the turning point, the decisive scene in which the quiet shock of receiving soap and lip balm becomes part of a much larger shift in the final days of the Okinawa campaign. The decisive turning point unfolded not inside a tent, but in the battered terrain surrounding it. Okinawa in late June 1945 was no longer a battlefield. It was a collapse. The final Japanese defensive positions had fallen. Caves once guarded by disciplined troops were now silent. The last coordinated resistance had ceased, and from these shattered positions emerged the final groups of Japanese personnel: the wounded, the starving, the dehydrated, and the women officers who had survived the bombardments of Shuri Line and the chaotic retreats into the southern ridges. The moment of surrender for these women was not a single event, but an inevitable convergence of exhaustion and reality. American patrols had swept the area for days, moving cautiously through ravines and cave networks. They encountered pockets of survivors, some ready to surrender, others confused or terrified, many injured and unable to move without assistance. Among them were Japanese women officers from communications units, medical detachments, and auxiliary commands. Their uniforms, once neatly pressed, were faded and torn. Their belts hung loosely from malnourished frames. Their boots, soaked repeatedly in mud and seawater, had hardened into stiff shells. As these officers were escorted toward American processing stations, the psychological tension reached its peak. They had been told for years what capture meant: death, violation, humiliation. Yet what they encountered instead was structure, lines, tents, clipped orders, medical teams, and an unexpected sense of calm. This orderliness intensified their shock. It defied every narrative they had internalized. The climax begins the moment they stepped across the threshold of the processing tent. It was not simply a room. It was a boundary between 2 worlds. Inside, American medics performed routine checks with clinical precision. They examined hands for burns, checked feet for infections, and looked for dehydration. For each woman, The procedure was the same. Sit, hold out your hands, drink water, wait for instructions. But it was the table at the far end, the table with the hygiene kits, that transformed the moment from procedural to pivotal. That table represented the overwhelming imbalance of the war's final stage. On it sat items the women had not seen in months. Small tins of lip balm, wrapped bars of soap, folded cloths, and disinfectant packets. The supplies were arranged in neat rows. Their abundance was unmistakable. The Japanese officers approached with caution. Some paused before reaching the table, uncertain whether they were allowed to touch the items. Others looked toward interpreters for direction. A few stepped forward automatically, driven by sheer exhaustion more than understanding. The pivotal moment came when the first woman officer, dehydrated, trembling, her uniform caked with dust, extended her hand to receive a bar of soap. She accepted it slowly, as if it were a fragile artifact. The medic placed a small tin of lip balm in her other hand. She stared at it without speaking. A long silence hung in the air. Then, something subtle but unmistakable happened. A visible shift in posture, a momentary break in the rigid mask she had maintained through days of suffering. Her shoulders lowered. Her eyes blinked rapidly. Her lips pressed tightly together, not out of defiance, but out of the emotional weight of the gesture. This reaction rippled through the group. Another officer stepped forward, then another. Each one mirrored the same stunned expression, a mix of dignity strained to its limit and disbelief that something so small, so intimate, was being offered by the enemy. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Japanese women, it was the collapse of a wall built over years of indoctrination. A medic later noted in his report that the female prisoners were most visibly affected by the toiletries distribution. Their reaction was unlike anything seen from male prisoners. He described them as frozen in place, as if the items carried symbolic meaning. They did. In that moment, the women officers confronted not just defeat, but the material truth of defeat. The empire that once demanded absolute loyalty could no longer provide even soap. The enemy they had been taught to fear and now stood before them with supplies the Japanese military had long ceased to distribute. The climax deepened further when one officer, older than the others, likely in her mid-30s, with the insignia of a supervisory role, attempted to refuse the items. Her refusal was not hostile. It was ceremonial, as if to uphold a final fragment of military pride. But her hand shook. Her lips were cracked. American personnel insisted gently, and after a long pause, she accepted the items. The moment marked the breaking point. Her acceptance signaled that there was no remaining boundary between pride and reality. No more strength to maintain the facade. No more illusions about the empire's promises. A quiet ripple passed through the group as she stepped aside. Several women lowered their heads. A few wiped their eyes discreetly. The psychological collapse, long delayed, suppressed beneath layers of discipline, had finally arrived. This was the turning point, the instant when the symbolic exchange of soap and lip balm crystallized the full recognition of defeat. Yet the climax did not end inside the tent. What happened immediately afterward revealed even more about the emotional and historical significance of the moment. The days following the distribution of basic hygiene items became a quiet turning point inside the Allied internment facilities. What had begun as a simple act, routine to the medical teams, almost trivial to the quartermasters, rippled through the Japanese women officers with an intensity the guards did not fully grasp at first. For the Japanese women, many of whom had served as clerks, nurses, or auxiliary officers in the bamboo and concrete bureaucracy of the empire, captivity had initially been defined by uncertainty. They expected interrogations. They expected distance. Some even expected humiliation based on the harsh treatment Japanese propaganda insisted Allied prisoners would receive in Japanese hands. But now, In the sharp mid-morning light of the camp, the psychological line between captor and captive began to blur. The Allied camp commandants noticed it first during routine inspections. Japanese women officers who once stood rigid, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes down, now met the gaze of the medical orderlies. They still bowed, still maintained etiquette, but something had changed. Fear had shifted into a kind of cautious comprehension. The point of no return arrived when a small group of Japanese nurses requested permission to help in the infirmary, not as a negotiation tactic, but because they recognized familiar medical procedures. They saw 4 bags hung correctly. They saw severely malnourished Allied internees being stabilized with the same precision they had once practiced in military hospitals in Yokohama or Sendai. And so, quietly, the women offered assistance. What happened next became part of internal camp reports filed by American medical teams and later noted in the archives of the Far East Command. Under supervision, Japanese women officers began assisting with wound cleaning, bandage preparation, and basic nursing tasks. It was not a formalized labor program. No one forced them. It emerged naturally from a shared professional instinct. Nurses taking care of human beings. It was here, amid the antiseptic smell of diluted carbolic acid and the soft scraping of metal trays, that the most intense moment of the entire captivity unfolded. One former Japanese Army nurse recognized fungal infections on the feet of an Australian POW and murmured, almost reflexively, "We treated this in Burma." An American medical lieutenant overheard her. Instead of reacting with suspicion, he handed her a fresh pair of gloves. That gesture, simple, wordless, was the true climax. It shattered the war's propaganda on both sides. For the Japanese women, trained to believe Allied forces were brutal and unrefined, the reality proved sharply different. For the Americans and Australians, who had suffered years of Japanese captivity throughout the Pacific, seeing professional Japanese nurses treat Allied patients with calm precision triggered a complicated mix of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and the strange awareness that their captives were also victims of a system larger than any of them. Camp guards later recalled the scene in their personal memoirs: a row of beds, Allied patients resting under thin blankets, and Japanese women in faded khaki uniforms cleaning surgical scissors with slow, practiced movements. The afternoon sun cut long shadows across the wooden floors. No one spoke much. It felt like a moment outside the war, something fragile and unrepeatable. The shift spread beyond the infirmary. When hygiene kits were distributed again, bars of soap, small tins of balm, rolls of bandages, the Japanese women accepted them not as bewildering curiosities, but as tools they now understood were meant to preserve dignity in an environment where dignity was often scarce. One officer later wrote in a 1978 interview with a Japanese historian, "I realized then that the enemy offered us what we had feared we would need to beg for: basic human respect. And once we accepted it, we could no longer see them as monsters." This change in perception altered camp dynamics in measurable ways. Reports noted fewer disciplinary incidents. Guards observed more cooperation with daily routines. And the women themselves began speaking more freely during post-capture interrogations, not out of coercion, but because the hostility they expected never materialized. Yet beneath this fragile atmosphere was the steady hum of a collapsing empire. News of Japan's worsening situation, cities firebombed, supply routes destroyed, families displaced, filtered into the camp through official briefings. Some women learned their homes had been obliterated in the bombing of Kobe or Tokyo. Others discovered their units had been wiped out in the Philippines or burned alive inside collapsing hospitals in Okinawa. The emotional collision was brutal. Here they were, receiving medical care and small mercies from an enemy they had been told to fear, while their own nation descended into destruction. That emotional whiplash, the stark contrast between care and captivity and suffering at home, became the final devastating twist of the climax. Japanese women officers found themselves confronting two truths at once. Their captors were not what the Empire had taught them to expect. Their homeland was experiencing a catastrophe far greater than they imagined. The climax ends at the moment these two truths collide. The moment they understood that survival meant reconciling the world they had been raised to believe with the world they now witnessed firsthand. From this point, the story moves inevitably toward the consequences, toward the long, painful journey home. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Japanese women officers inside Allied camps felt the world tilt beneath them. News of the surrender did not arrive with ceremony. It came through a quiet announcement, delivered by an Allied officer with a clipped tone, as if even he understood the gravity of what he was saying. For many of the women, the words did not make sense at first. Japan surrendered. The empire they had been taught would fight to the last breath had collapsed under the weight of atomic fire, naval strangulation, and years of attrition. Some Japanese women officers fell to their knees in silence. Others stared ahead, expression frozen, as if trying to process that decades of national ideology had evaporated in a single sentence. Yet the Allied response to Japan's capitulation was not cruelty. It was procedure. Over the following weeks, camps began shifting into repatriation mode. Medical screenings intensified. Nutrition levels were monitored. Personal details were recorded for transport logs. The Japanese women were issued additional hygiene supplies, cleaner uniforms, more soap, hairbrushes, toothbrushes, items intended not just for health, but to present them with dignity for the moment of return. To the Allied staff, this was routine. To the women, it felt surreal. Some had never used Western-style toothbrushes. Others had gone months without seeing their faces clearly in a mirror. Now, they combed their hair, washed their hands with scented soap, and prepared to return home to a land they no longer recognized. The first step of the journey was transport by truck or rail to coastal processing centers, typically in Manila, Singapore, or Rangoon, where Japanese POWs awaited ships under Allied supervision. The Japanese women traveled with male POWs, but were controlled separately for their safety. Allied commanders issued strict orders: no harassment, no retaliation, no exploitation. These rules were enforced with military precision. In multiple cases, U.S. and Australian officers reprimanded their own troops for inappropriate behavior. The occupation authorities were determined to preserve professional integrity, fully aware of the long list of atrocities committed by Imperial forces across Asia. For the women, the care was both reassuring and confusing. At one Philippines staging facility, U.S. Army nurses provided them with powdered milk and vitamin tablets, explaining in slow English how to take them. At another site in Burma, an Australian medic taught a group of Japanese clerks how to apply foot powder to prevent fungus during the sea voyage. The enemy was preparing them for safe return. No one had imagined such an ending. When the women finally boarded repatriation ships, often converted hospital vessels or transport freighters, they found the decks crowded with soldiers, civilians, and former forced laborers. The Japanese flag no longer flew above them. Instead, they sailed under Allied escort, their nation's defeat evident in every rivet of the ship. Doctors issued each woman a personal health card noting weight, symptoms, and required monitoring. Nurses distributed seasickness tablets. Guards explained safety measures in calm, practiced tones. These details were recorded meticulously in occupation logs. The Allied command understood that the treatment of POWs, even defeated enemies, would shape global perceptions during the fragile transition to peace. But for the women themselves, the voyage home carried a heavy emotional undertow. At night, they gathered quietly on the upper deck. Some spoke in hushed voices about the rumors. Tokyo in ruins. Hiroshima gone. Families displaced. Food shortages sweeping every major city. Others said nothing at all. Many wondered whether they would be met with sympathy or shame. Japan's military culture had never fully confronted the concept of captivity, especially for women. To surrender was unthinkable. To survive captivity was even more complicated. Returning home meant navigating a society wounded, starving, and struggling to understand the reality of total defeat. Yet even in this uncertainty, one memory persisted. The moment Allied personnel had handed them small items, bars of soap, tins of balm, packets of disinfectant, with no expectation in return. That act, so minor at the time, now stood out sharply as the ship crossed the dark water toward their homeland. Because the next stage of their story, stepping into a devastated Japan, would test every assumption these women carried. And that transition leads directly into the next part of the aftermath. When the repatriation vessels finally reached Japan in late 1945 and early 1946, the Japanese women officers walked down the gangplanks not as returning soldiers, but as survivors of a war their country could barely comprehend anymore. The ports that greeted them, Sasebo, Hakadiri, Maizu, Kure, bore almost no resemblance to the bustling harbors they remembered. Warehouses were gutted shells. Rail lines twisted like broken ribs. Black market stalls lined the streets, offering wilted vegetables and scrap metal. Children in patched clothing watched the former POWs with wide, wary eyes. For many of the women, the first shock came not from the devastation itself, but from the silence. Japan's defeat hung in the air like a permanent fog. Civilians avoided eye contact. Conversations were hushed. Even the wind seemed to move more slowly through the ruined districts. Allied occupation trucks rolled by with guards in crisp uniforms, an image that still felt surreal to the women who had spent months receiving care from those same forces. At processing centers set up by SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the women underwent mandatory health checks. Doctors recorded weight, blood pressure, vitamin deficiencies, and signs of tropical disease. Nurses measured muscle loss and anemia rates, comparing them against other POW groups. These medical logs, quiet, bureaucratic, unemotional, would become some of the most valuable documentation of female POW experiences in the Pacific War. Yet outside the clinics, the emotional reality was far more complicated. Families arrived to meet their daughters, sisters, and wives with a mixture of relief, shock, and confusion. Some embraced the women tightly, grateful simply for survival. Others hesitated, aware of the lingering cultural expectation that captivity itself implied dishonor. A few women found no one waiting. Entire neighborhoods had burned in the 1945 bombings. Parents were gone, siblings missing. In some cases, neighbors informed returning POWs that their homes had vanished under firestorms months earlier. The war had erased the familiar structure of their lives. But what troubled the women most was the profound disparity between their expectations of captivity and the reality they had endured. They had imagined cruelty. Instead, they had received soap, lip balm, disinfectant, and medical care, items their own country could no longer afford to distribute to civilians. This contradiction lingered in their minds long after the initial reunions. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the women visited ration lines and saw mothers boiling weeds for soup. Hospitals ran with minimal supplies. The black market thrived because official rations barely supported life. It was not uncommon for former women officers to realize, with painful clarity, that their final months in Allied custody had been safer and cleaner than the conditions awaiting them in post-war Japan. Some tried to hide this truth. Others admitted it only decades later in interviews, memoirs, and academic consultations. A former communications clerk, interviewed in the 1990s, described it simply. I returned home expecting shame. Instead, I found a nation so devastated that my captivity did not matter compared to survival. Reintegration varied dramatically. A few resumed pre-war skills: clerical work, nursing, textile labor. Many struggled with malnutrition and chronic illnesses acquired during earlier evacuations and wartime shortages. Those with military training often avoided speaking about their service entirely, especially in the early occupation years when Japanese society was redefining its relationship with its own wartime institutions. But the memory of Allied treatment remained a quiet undercurrent. Even women who felt bitterness toward the defeat acknowledged the professionalism of the camp medical staff. Others described a kind of reluctant gratitude, an emotion difficult to express openly in a nation still processing its identity after surrender. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Japan rebuilt into a prosperous nation, historians began collecting testimonies from surviving POWs. The accounts of Japanese women officers drew particular attention because of their rarity and because they revealed a dimension of the Pacific War often overshadowed by larger military narratives. Their stories added nuance to a conflict remembered for some of the harshest prisoner conditions in modern history. They demonstrated that moments of compassion and professionalism existed even amid global violence. And they highlighted how assumptions formed in wartime propaganda broke down when confronted with reality. The aftermath closes on the image of these women rebuilding their lives in a Japan reborn from ruins, carrying memories of captivity that did not fit neatly into national narratives, and reflecting quietly on what they had witnessed on both sides of the war. And from this complex landscape, loss, contradiction, dignity, and survival, emerges the final question that guides our conclusion. What does their experience teach us about humanity in the midst of destruction? This leads naturally into the reflection, where the meaning of their ordeal becomes clear. In the end, the story of the Japanese women officers who received soap and lip balm inside Allied captivity is not a tale of dramatic battles or strategic triumphs. It is something quieter, more human, more difficult to categorize within the usual lines of wartime memory. These women entered the war believing the world was sharply divided, Japan on one side, the enemy on the other. They were taught that surrender was shame, captivity was worse, and Allied forces were ruthless and indifferent. Yet the reality they encountered, rationed but consistent medical care, basic hygiene items offered without humiliation, and the steady professionalism of camp personnel, challenged every assumption they carried. Their shock at receiving simple items was not weakness. It was the result of years of propaganda meeting the unvarnished truth. For Allied staff, these gestures were ordinary. To the women, they represented an unexpected form of respect, one that forced them to confront the gap between ideology and lived experience. And when they returned home to a Japan in ashes, they saw their country struggling to survive with far less than what they had been given in captivity. The contrast was painful. It left many with memories they could not fully articulate in the early post-war years, when the nation sought unity through silence rather than introspection. Yet their testimonies, preserved in interviews, letters, and fragmented memoirs decades later, reveal a profound lesson. In a war defined by brutality, there were moments when individuals acted simply as human beings. Moments when care crossed battle lines. Moments when dignity was protected rather than denied. These moments did not erase the horrors of the Pacific War. They did not balance the scales or undo the suffering inflicted across Asia and the Pacific. But they mattered because they showed that even in a conflict shaped by total destruction, humanity could still survive in small, almost invisible gestures, like the hand that offered a bar of soap or the medic who handed a Japanese nurse a pair of gloves without hesitation. The women remembered these moments not because they were grand, but because they were real. Their story reminds us that war exposes the worst of human nature, yet it also reveals the quiet resilience of compassion. And in that fragile space, where enemies briefly become caregivers and captives rediscover dignity, we find the part of history that refuses to disappear. The part that still speaks to us,